Hello everyone. Welcome back to Naruto Fix. Today we have another interesting what if Naruto story. Which is what if Naruto became the final villain after saving everyone. Part 1. Make sure to like and subscribe if you enjoy this content. Now, without wasting any time, let's begin. The world cheered. The war was over. The sky was finally clear. No more Madara. No more Kagaya. No more endless bloodshed. And standing at the center of victory, smiling, exhausted, covered in scars, was Naruto Uzumaki. We did it, he whispered. Around him, shinobi from every nation stood together. Not as enemies, not as rivals, but as one. For the first time in history, there was peace. Real peace. Cheers echoed across the battlefield. People cried. People laughed. People finally felt alive again. And yet, Naruto didn't. His smile faded slowly. Not because something was wrong, but because something felt missing. Why does it feel so empty? That question was the beginning of everything. Days passed. Naruto returned to Konoha as a hero. Celebrated, respected, loved. But something had changed. Inside the Hokage office, Kakashi Hatake looked at Naruto carefully. You've been quiet lately. Naruto smiled slightly. Just tired. A lie. Because Naruto Uzumaki was never just tired. Outside, the village thrived. Children played. Shinobi trained. Everything Naruto had fought for was finally real. And yet, at night, he couldn't sleep. Because every time he closed his eyes, he saw something. Not the war, not the enemies, but the future. A future where peace didn't last. Naruto whispered in the dark. Not again. Because he could see it clearer than anything. The cycle repeating. Nations slowly dividing. Conflicts rising. Hatred returning. And no matter what he had done, it would all happen again. So this is it. A pause. This is what everything leads to. Silence answered him. Because deep down, he knew. Saving the world once wasn't enough. The next morning, Naruto stood at the edge of the village. Looking out. Not as a hero, but as someone who had seen too much. If peace can't last, a pause, then I'll make it last. That thought was dangerous. Because Naruto wasn't just strong. He was determined. And when those two things combined, nothing could stop him. Days later, things began to change. Small at first. Conflicts disappeared. Tensions faded. Decisions aligned. Too perfectly. Inside Konoha, Shikamaru Nara frowned at reports. This doesn't make sense. Everything is resolving too smoothly. Kakashi looked up. That's a problem. Quote. Shikamaru's eyes narrowed. It is when it shouldn't be possible. A pause. Something, or someone, is controlling this. Silence. Because that had never happened before. Far away, Naruto stood alone, eyes calm, presence heavy. It's working, he said quietly. Because already, the world was stabilizing. Not naturally, but perfectly. More war. A faint smile appeared. More suffering. But that smile wasn't the same as before. It wasn't warm. It wasn't hopeful. It was resolved. Because Naruto had crossed a line. Not physically, but mentally. He no longer believed in saving the world. He believed in controlling it. Back in Konoha, a presence appeared behind Naruto. So it's true. Naruto didn't turn. Yeah. Standing there, watching him carefully, was Sasuke Uchiha. You're the one doing this. Naruto didn't deny it. I have to. Sasuke's eyes sharpened. This isn't peace. Naruto finally turned. It is. A pause. It just doesn't look like the one you wanted. The air grew heavy. Because now, the roles had begun to shift. Naruto stepped forward. I saved everyone once. A pause. But this time, his eyes hardened slightly. I'll make sure they never need saving again. Silence. Because that sentence marked the beginning of something irreversible. Sasuke's voice dropped. Even if you have to become the enemy. Naruto didn't hesitate. Especially then. And in that moment, the greatest hero the world had ever known began to disappear. And in his place, something far more dangerous was born. Not a villain driven by hatred, but one driven by purpose. And that was far worse. The air between them didn't move. It tightened. Because this wasn't just a disagreement anymore. It was the moment the world's greatest hero crossed into something else entirely. Standing face to face, Naruto Uzumaki and Sasuke Uchiha didn't raise their fists. They raised their beliefs. You're serious? Sasuke said quietly. Naruto didn't blink. More than ever. A pause. I've seen what happens if I don't do this. Sasuke's eyes narrowed. Then you're seeing only one future. Naruto shook his head slowly. Number. A pause. I'm seeing the only one that always happens. That answer was heavy. Because it wasn't fear. It was certainty. Naruto stepped forward. You think people will change. But they don't. They repeat. Quote. The wind moved slightly. War. Hate. Loss. His voice lowered. Again and again. Sasuke didn't argue immediately. Because part of him knew that was true. But still. And your answer is to take that choice away. Quote. Naruto met his gaze. My answer is to remove the possibility. Silence. Because that was far worse. Not stopping war, but making it impossible. Sasuke's grip tightened. That's not saving them. A step forward. That's controlling them. Naruto didn't deny it. Yes. A pause. And it works. That word again. Works. Sasuke exhaled sharply. You sound like me. Naruto smirked faintly. Yeah. Guess I finally understand you now. Quote. That line carried history. Because once Sasuke walked this path, and Naruto stopped him. Now, the roles had reversed, and Sasuke had to do the same. Then I'll stop you. Naruto's expression didn't change. Try. And just like that, the ground beneath them cracked. Not from rage, but from intent. They moved. Fast. Precise. Deadly. Sasuke struck first. Lightning tearing through the air. Naruto blocked. Effortlessly. Not overpowering. But perfect. You're holding back, Sasuke said. Naruto stepped in. Closer. So are you. Another clash. Faster. Sharper. Because both of them knew. This wasn't about strength. It was about who would break first. Naruto didn't attack to destroy. He countered to control. Every movement minimal. Every reaction flawless. Like he wasn't fighting. He was ending the fight before it began. You've gone too far, Sasuke said. Naruto's voice stayed calm. Not far enough. A pause. Not until this world can't fall apart again. That belief was unshakable. And that made Naruto more dangerous than any enemy before. Sasuke pushed harder. More speed. More power. Trying to break through that calm. That certainty. But Naruto didn't crack. Not yet. Because deep down, he still believed he was right. And as long as he believed that, no one could stop him. Not even Sasuke. But somewhere, very deep, a small doubt remained. Quiet. Hidden. But real. And that doubt would decide everything. The clash didn't end. It shifted. Not louder. Not more destructive. But deeper. Because with every strike, every counter, every word exchanged between Naruto Uzumaki and Sasuke Uchiha, something else was being tested. Not strength. Conviction. Sasuke moved again. Faster than before. Space bent. Lightning surged. But Naruto didn't react immediately. For a split second, he just stood there, watching. You're hesitating, Sasuke said. Naruto blocked the attack, but slightly later than before. Not weak, but not perfect. Naruto replied calmly. I'm thinking. That difference was everything. Because Naruto had never needed to think mid-fight. He always knew. He always moved. Without doubt. But now, that certainty wasn't complete. Sasuke noticed instantly. Good. He whispered. Because that meant Naruto wasn't fully convinced anymore. Another clash. Closer. Faster. Sasuke stepped in, grabbing Naruto's arm. You don't believe this completely. Naruto didn't pull away immediately. I do. But this time, there was a pause, and Sasuke caught it. A step closer. You want to believe it. Silence. Because that was the truth Naruto didn't want to face. Naruto pushed him back. Harder this time. It doesn't matter what I feel. A pause. It matters what works. That line sounded different now. Not strong. Not absolute. But forced. Sasuke's eyes sharpened. You're lying to yourself. Naruto's expression tightened slightly. I'm doing what's necessary. Sasuke didn't stop. And what happens when necessary turns into everything? Quote. Naruto froze. Just for a moment. Because that question didn't have a clean answer. Then I carry it, Naruto said. Quiet. Heavy. I carry all of it. That answer was real. And that's what made it dangerous. Because Naruto wasn't doing this out of hatred. He was doing it out of responsibility. And that could justify anything. The fight slowed. Not because they were tired. But because words had become heavier than blows. Sasuke stepped forward again. You don't need to carry everything. Naruto shook his head. Someone has to. A pause. And I'm the only one who can. That belief was the core, the foundation of everything he had become. Sasuke looked at him carefully. Or maybe a pause. You just don't trust anyone else to try. That line hit harder than any attack. Naruto's eyes widened slightly. Not visibly. But enough. Because deep down, that was true too. Not just fear of war. But lack of trust. Naruto exhaled slowly. I trusted them once. A pause. And look what happened. Silence. Because that pain still hadn't healed. Sasuke didn't deny it. Yeah, they failed you. A step closer. But that doesn't mean everyone will. Naruto looked away slightly. It's not a risk I can take. Sasuke shook his head. Then you've already decided they'll fail. Quote. Another pause. And that makes you no different from the people who gave up on you. That line cut deep. Because it flipped everything. Naruto stepped back slightly. Not from fear. But from thought. Because for the first time, his reasoning was being questioned at its core. The wind moved again. Soft. Almost like it was waiting. Because now, the fight had reached its final point. Not physical, but personal. Naruto looked at Sasuke again. If I'm wrong, he said quietly, then everything falls apart. Sasuke didn't hesitate. And if you're right, a pause. Then nothing ever grows. Silence. Because both outcomes were terrifying. And Naruto had to choose between them. Control. Or trust. Certainty. Or possibility. Naruto closed his eyes slowly. And for the first time, he didn't move. He didn't attack. He didn't defend. He just stopped. Because this was the real battle. And it wasn't one he could win with power. The battlefield fell completely silent, but this silence was no longer tense. It was heavy with realization, as Naruto Uzumaki stood still for the first time since their fight began, his body unmoving will. His mind raced faster than ever before. The wind brushed past him gently, yet he didn't react, because Sasuke's words had struck something far deeper than any attack ever could. For years, Naruto had believed that strength meant protecting everyone at any cost, that carrying the burden alone was the only way to ensure peace. But now, standing in front of Sasuke Uchiha, that belief didn't feel as absolute as it once had. Naruto slowly clenched his fist, not out of anger, but out of uncertainty, something he had almost forgotten how to feel. His voice came out quieter than before, yet heavier with meaning as he said that if he let go now, everything could fall apart again. All the wars, all the hatred, all the suffering he had worked so hard to end could return, and this time, there might not be anyone strong enough to stop it. But even as he said those words, a small part of him questioned whether that fear was truly about the world, or about himself. Sasuke didn't rush forward, didn't attack, didn't even raise his guard. Instead, he simply looked at Naruto, understanding him in a way no one else could, because he had once stood in that exact same place, believing that controlling everything was the only way to fix it. He took a slow step closer and told Naruto calmly that the world doesn't become stronger when one person carries everything, it becomes dependent, and the moment that person disappears, everything collapses even worse than before. His voice wasn't filled with anger or judgment, but with experience, and that made his words even harder to ignore. Naruto's eyes shifted slightly as he processed that, and for a brief moment, the image of the future he had been trying to prevent flickered in his mind again. But this time, it wasn't the same. Instead of endless war, he saw something else too. People struggling, failing, making mistakes, but also learning, growing, standing back up again. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't controlled. But it was real. And that realization shook him more than anything else. He exhaled slowly, his shoulders dropping just a little, as if the weight he had been carrying for so long had finally begun to crack. He admitted quietly that he was afraid, not of losing power, not of being defeated, but of being wrong. Because if he was wrong, then everything he had done, everything he had taken from the world, would mean he had become the very thing he once fought against. And that was something Naruto Uzumaki had never wanted to be. Sasuke's expression softened slightly, and he told him that being wrong wasn't the end, it was the beginning of doing things the right way. He reminded Naruto that strength was never about controlling everything, it was about trusting others to stand with you, even if they might fail sometimes. Because without that risk, there was no real future, only a frozen world that could never move forward. For a long moment, Naruto didn't say anything. The battlefield, the sky, even the air itself seemed to pause along with him, as if the entire world was waiting for his decision. Then slowly, he opened his eyes again, and this time, they weren't filled with cold certainty or overwhelming control. They were clear, human, and uncertain, but honest. Naruto looked at his hand, the same hand that had taken control of everything, the same hand that could end all conflict with a single decision, and for the first time, he didn't see power in it. He saw responsibility. Not to control the world, but to trust it. His grip loosened slightly, and he whispered that maybe, just maybe, peace wasn't something you could force to last forever, maybe it was something people had to keep choosing again and again. That thought changed everything. Because in that moment, Naruto didn't feel like a villain anymore, but he also didn't feel like a hero. He felt like someone standing between both. And that was the most important place he had ever been. Naruto stood there for a long moment, his gaze still fixed on his own hand as if trying to understand something he had ignored for too long. And for the first time since the war ended, the overwhelming certainty that had driven every one of his decisions began to fade into something far more complicated. The world around him didn't change, the sky was still clear, the battlefield still silent, and Sasuke still stood in front of him, but internally, everything was shifting. He slowly lowered his hand, not out of defeat, but because he was no longer sure that holding it up, holding everything ether, was the right thing to do anymore. He took a deep breath, and when he finally spoke, his voice wasn't heavy with control or cold resolve like before, but quieter, more grounded, as if he was speaking not as someone above the world, but as someone still part of it. He admitted that he had been so focused on preventing the future he feared that he never stopped to consider what kind of present he was creating. In trying to eliminate every possibility of pain, he had also eliminated choice, growth, and the very freedom that gave peace its meaning. And now, standing here, he could finally see it clearly. Peace forced by one person wasn't peace, it was just silence. Sasuke listened without interrupting, because this wasn't something that needed to be rushed or pushed, and he understood that Naruto reaching this point meant more than any battle he could have fought. He stepped a little closer, not as an opponent anymore, but as someone who had once walked this exact path and barely managed to turn back from it. He told Naruto that the world would never be perfect, that people would still fight, still make mistakes, still hurt each other, that was exactly why it mattered. Because when people chose to do better despite all that, that choice had meaning. And without that, even a perfect world would feel empty. Naruto closed his eyes again for a brief second, letting those words settle, and this time, instead of resisting them, he accepted them. The future he had feared didn't disappear, it was still there, still possible, but now it wasn't the only thing he could see. There were other possibilities too, uncertain, fragile, imperfect, but real. And for the first time, he allowed himself to believe that maybe the world didn't need to be controlled to survive, maybe it just needed a chance to keep trying. When he opened his eyes again, something had changed completely. The overwhelming presence that had been pressing down on the entire world began to fade, not violently, not suddenly, but naturally, like a weight being lifted. Far away, across the nations, shinobi who had been standing still without even realizing why slowly began to move again, conversations resumed, decisions returned to their own hands, and the world, imperfect as it was, started breathing on its own again. Naruto looked at Sasuke, and this time there was no tension between them, no clash waiting to happen, just understanding. He admitted quietly that he didn't know what would happen next, that maybe things would fall apart again, maybe conflicts would return, maybe everything he feared would still come true, but this time, he wouldn't try to control it all alone. Instead, he would stand with the world, not above it, and face whatever came together with everyone else. Sasuke gave a small nod, not as approval, but as acknowledgement, because that decision wasn't easy, and it wasn't something just anyone could make. Letting go of control when you had the power to hold everything together required more strength than taking control in the first place, and Sasuke knew that better than anyone. Naruto turned slightly, looking out toward the horizon where the light of the sun was beginning to spread again, and for First time since everything began, that light didn't feel distant or hollow. It felt real. He exhaled slowly, a faint, genuine smile forming. Not the forced one he wore as a ruler, not the empty one he showed after the war, but a simple, human one. Because now, he wasn't trying to become the savior of the world, or its ruler. He was just trying to be a part of it again. And even though the future was uncertain, even though nothing was guaranteed anymore, that uncertainty no longer felt like something to fear. It felt like something worth believing in. Naruto remained standing at the same spot for a while, but the world around him no longer felt distant or controlled. It felt alive again, moving on its own without needing him to guide every moment. The silence that once felt heavy and unnatural had been replaced by something softer, something real, and as he looked across the horizon, he realized that for the first time since the war ended, he wasn't trying to predict what would happen next. He wasn't searching for threats, wasn't calculating outcomes. He was simply watching, letting the world move forward without interference. A faint breeze passed through, carrying distant sounds, voices, movement, life, and Naruto listened to it quietly, almost as if he was hearing the world properly. The first time. For so long, he had been focused on preventing everything that could go wrong that he had stopped noticing what was already right. That realization settled deep within him, not as regret, but as something he needed to accept. Because no matter how strong he became, no matter how much he tried, he could never create a perfect world, and maybe that was never the point. Sasuke stood beside him now, no longer tense, no longer prepared to fight, just present. He didn't say anything at first, because there was nothing left that needed to be forced into words. Naruto had already reached the conclusion on his own, and that made it real. After a moment, Sasuke spoke quietly, saying that things wouldn't be easy from here, that conflicts would return eventually, and that people would still make mistakes. But this time, Naruto wouldn't be alone in dealing with it. This time, the burden wouldn't rest on just one person's shoulders. Naruto gave a small nod, acknowledging that truth, and though the weight of everything he had done still remained, it no longer felt suffocating. It felt shared. He admitted that part of him still wanted to take control again, still feared what might happen if things went wrong, but now he understood that giving into that fear would only repeat the same mistake. Strength wasn't about eliminating uncertainty, it was about standing firm even when uncertainty existed. As they began walking back toward the village, Naruto noticed something he hadn't paid attention to in a long time: the simple details. The sound of footsteps on the ground, the way the light shifted through the trees, the feeling of movement without resistance. These small things, things he had once taken for granted, now felt meaningful again, because they were no longer controlled or shaped by him. They were just there. Back in Konoha, the change was already being felt. Shinobi who had unknowingly been moving under Naruto's influence were now making their own decisions again, and while there was confusion at first, there was also something else: relief. Conversations resumed naturally, plans were discussed instead of silently aligned, and though everything wasn't perfectly coordinated anymore, it felt more genuine. Life hadn't become easier, but it had become real again. Naruto stopped at the entrance of the village for a moment, looking at it not as a ruler returning to his domain, but as someone coming back home. The same place that had once rejected him, the same place he had once tried to control, now stood in front of him as it always had: imperfect, complicated, but still worth protecting. He exhaled slowly, and this time, there was no hesitation in his step as he moved forward. Because now, He wasn't walking in as the one who would fix everything. He was walking in as someone who would face everything together with everyone else. And even though the future remained uncertain, even though nothing was guaranteed anymore, Naruto didn't try to see it all at once. For the first time, he allowed the future to come to him, one step at a time. And that was enough. Naruto's return to Konoha didn't come with cheers this time, nor with the overwhelming celebration he had received after the war. Instead, it was quiet, almost uncertain, as if the village itself didn't know how to react to him anymore. People saw him, recognized him, but there was hesitation in their eyes, because even if they didn't fully understand what had happened, they could feel that something about Naruto had changed, and that change carried a weight they couldn't easily ignore. He walked through the streets slowly, not avoiding anyone, not hiding, but also not trying to draw attention. Every step felt grounded, real, and for the first time in a long while, he wasn't walking with a plan in mind. He wasn't calculating outcomes or adjusting unseen forces, he was simply moving forward. The sounds of the village surrounded him again. Children laughing, shopkeepers calling out, shinobi talking about missions, and instead of analyzing it, he let it be. That alone felt unfamiliar, but in a way that was calming. Inside the Hokage office, Kakashi Hatake stood by the window, already aware of Naruto's return long before anyone reported it. He didn't look surprised, nor tense, just thoughtful, as if he had been waiting for this moment. When Naruto entered, there was no immediate conversation. The two simply looked at each other for a few seconds, and in that silence, Kakashi understood more than any explanation could have given him. Naruto wasn't the same as before, but he also wasn't lost. Kakashi finally spoke, his tone calm but direct, asking if Naruto had finished what he started. Naruto paused slightly at that question, not because he didn't have an answer, but because the answer wasn't as simple as it once would have been. He shook his head gently and said that it wasn't something that could ever truly be finished. The world wouldn't stay perfect, and it wasn't supposed to. That realization didn't feel like failure anymore, it felt like understanding. Kakashi gave a small nod, not surprised by that response, and told him that this was what being part of the world really meant. Dealing with things as they come, not trying to force them into a fixed outcome. He didn't praise Naruto, didn't criticize him either, because he knew that whatever Naruto had gone through, whatever he had almost become, had already taught him something far more valuable than any words could. Naruto stepped out of the office later with a lighter expression, not because everything was suddenly easy, but because he no longer felt like he had to carry everything alone. As he walked through the village again, some people still looked unsure, some still whispered, but others simply nodded, acknowledging him. Not as a perfect hero, not as something distant, but as someone who had struggled, made mistakes, and returned. As the sun began to set, Naruto found himself standing on the Hokage monument, looking out over the village just like he used to when he was younger. Back then, he had dreamed of becoming Hokage so everyone would acknowledge him. Later, he had nearly taken control of the entire world to protect it. And now, he stood there without chasing either of those things, simply taking in the view. He realized that strength didn't come from being above everyone, nor from controlling everything, it came from standing with others, even when things weren't perfect. That thought didn't erase the fear of what the future might bring, but it gave him something better than certainty. It gave him hope. And for Naruto Uzumaki, that was enough to keep moving forward. The night settled gently over Konoha, but for Naruto, it didn't bring rest, it brought reflection. Sitting alone atop the Hokage monument, Naruto Uzumaki stared out at the village lights flickering below, each one representing a life moving freely again, not guided, not controlled, just living. It should have felt like a complete victory, yet a quiet tension still lingered within him, not heavy like before, but present enough to remind him that letting go didn't mean everything would suddenly be easy. He leaned back slightly, resting his hands behind him, and allowed his thoughts to wander without trying to organize them. For so long, his mind had been sharp, calculating, always searching for the next problem before it even existed, but now that constant awareness was gone, and in its place was something unfamiliar, uncertainty. It didn't feel dangerous like he once thought it would. Instead, it felt honest. A soft sound broke the silence behind him, and without turning, Naruto already knew who it was. Sasuke Uchiha stepped up beside him, his presence quiet as always, but no longer carrying the tension of a looming fight. For a moment, neither of them spoke, because there was no need to revisit what had already been resolved. Instead, Sasuke simply looked out at the same view, sharing the moment without interrupting it. After a while, Sasuke asked a simple question: what Naruto planned to do next. It wasn't asked as a challenge, but as something genuine, because for the first time, Naruto didn't have a clear path laid out. In front of him, Naruto let out a small breath, almost a laugh, and admitted that he didn't know. Not in the way he used to, where he had every outcome mapped out, but in a different way. He knew he would keep moving forward, just not exactly how. Sasuke gave a faint nod at that answer, understanding it better than most would. He said that maybe not knowing was better, because it meant the future wasn't decided yet, and that was something worth protecting. Naruto looked at him, a small smile forming, and agreed. For once, uncertainty didn't feel like weakness, it felt like possibility. The two sat there a little longer, watching as the village slowly quieted down, until eventually Sasuke stood and prepared to leave. Before he did, he told Naruto one last thing: that if things ever started going too far again, he would be there to stop him. Naruto didn't take it as a threat. He nodded, accepting it, because now he understood that having someone who could stop you was just as important as having the strength to court. When Sasuke disappeared into the night, Naruto remained where he was, but the quiet no longer felt empty. It felt full of life, of choices, of a future that hadn't been decided yet. He looked down at his hand again, the same one that had once tried to hold the entire world in place, and this time. He didn't tighten it. He relaxed it. Because now, he didn't need to hold everything together. He just needed to be part of it. As the night passed and the first light of morning began to rise, Naruto stood up slowly, taking one last look at the village before turning away. There were still challenges ahead, still conflicts that would eventually come, but this time, he wouldn't face them as someone trying to control the outcome. He would face them as someone who believed in the world enough to let it grow. And that belief was stronger than any power he had ever held. The night gave way to dawn, and with it, something inside Naruto Uzumaki finally settled. Not into certainty, not into control, but into something far more difficult to hold onto: acceptance. As the first rays of sunlight spread across Konoha, the village slowly came to life again, unaware of just how close it had come to becoming something entirely different, something perfectly ordered, and completely empty. Naruto stood at the edge of the monument for a moment longer, looking down at the people below, and this time, he didn't see a system that needed to be fixed or protected at all costs. He saw individuals. Flawed, unpredictable, capable of both good and bad. And for the first time, he didn't try to NGE that. He accepted it. Because that was what made the world real. He let out a slow breath, the weight he had been carrying for so long no longer pressing down on him in the same way. It wasn't gone. It never would be. But it was no longer his alone to bear. That difference, small as it seemed, changed everything. Because now, he wasn't standing above the world, trying to hold it together. He was standing within it, ready to move forward alongside everyone else. Behind him, the past remained, the decisions he had made, the control he had taken, the line he had crossed. But instead of running from it or trying to justify it, Naruto simply acknowledged it. Those choices had shaped him, had brought him to this exact moment, and without them, he might never have understood what truly mattered. Not perfect peace, not absolute control, but a world where people could keep trying. Naruto turned away from the edge and began walking down, each step steady, grounded, no longer guided by the need to predict or control what came next. He didn't know what the future held, didn't know what conflicts might return or what challenges would arise, but for the first time, that uncertainty didn't feel like a threat. It felt like something worth protecting. As he stepped back into the village, the sounds of life greeted him once again. Simple, imperfect, real, and this time, he didn't analyze it, didn't try to shape it. He just walked forward, a faint, genuine smile forming on his face. Because Naruto Uzumaki, the one who had saved everyone, the one who had nearly become their final villain, had finally chosen something stronger than both. Not control, not power, but trust. And that choice was where his story truly began.